Tonight on The ReidOut.
This could have happened to thousands of little communities just like ours. We are not a poor, unclassy community. We are a community that a disaster happened to, that we didn't know how to respond to it. We just want answers.
People who live near the toxic train derailment in East Palestine, Ohio, are demanding answers about the potential health risks as the Biden administration vows to hold the railroad accountable. Senator Sherrod Brown, who met with the families today, will join me. And as those lawmakers were actually trying to help people, Kevin McCarthy was engaging in political theater at the southern border, while Ron DeSantis is seeking a rewrite of the Constitution. And Leslie Jones is here tonight. We will get her take on Florida's war on Black history, the UFOs, and much, much more. But we begin tonight with the latest rebuke in the ongoing saga of a twice impeached former president who continues to push the unfounded claims that the 2020 election was stolen. Newly unsealed portions of the Georgia Special Grand Jury's final report looking at potential election meddling by Donald Trump and his allies detail what literally every court body has already determined. The report states, quote, "We find by a unanimous vote that no widespread fraud took place in the Georgia 2020 presidential election." That absolutely shocking conclusion came following nearly 7 months of grand jury testimony from 75 different witnesses, including poll workers, investigators, Georgia officials, and, as they point out, people who still claim such fraud took place. According to the report, the grand jury also believes that at least some of those witnesses may have lied under oath. The report states a majority of the grand jury believes that perjury may have been committed by one or more witnesses testifying before it, and recommends that the district attorney seek appropriate indictments for such crimes where the evidence is compelling. This will all fall to Fulton County District Attorney Fani Willis as she decides on what, if any, charges should be brought from her investigation and against whom, up to and perhaps even including Donald Trump. A decision she has said is imminent. Not surprisingly, Trump is pulling a Bill Barr, trying to spin today's partial release as total exoneration. His campaign released this statement, quote, "The long-awaited important sections of the Georgia report, which do not even mention President Trump's name, have nothing to do with the president because President Trump did absolutely nothing wrong," unquote. His lawyers have also claimed that Trump never receiving a subpoena is further proof that he's in the clear. Now, we should point out that the substantive portions of the grand jury report are still sealed. And typically, when someone is not asked to come in, it could very well be because that person might be a target, not a witness. Joining me now is Charles Coleman Jr., civil rights attorney, former prosecutor and legal analyst, and Tia Mitchell, Washington correspondent for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. And Tia, I am going to start with you. I just want to go back to sort of refresh people's memory on who was on the infamous call in which Donald Trump incriminates himself and says, "I just need to find 11,000 X number of votes." And so it's Mark Meadows, his chief of staff, his lawyer, Cleta Mitchell, another lawyer advising him named Kurt Hilbert, Brad Raffensperger, very important, the Georgia Secretary of State, who did testify in this to the grand jury, Ryan Germany, a general counsel for the Secretary of State's office, and the Deputy Secretary of State, a guy named Jordan Fuchs. When you think about that list of people and those who actually did sit for interviews, and you hear people might have lied, I want to put that list up of people who testified who were more Trump's people. I mean, there's Raffensperger, obviously. You have Brian Kemp. You can't imagine him wanting to do that. You've got Newt Gingrich. You've got Lindsey Graham. You've got Rudy Giuliani. You've got Mark Meadows. Is there any reporting on anyone feeling nervous about their testimony, having heard that the grand jury believes someone lied?
Well, I think one of the most interesting things today is you're not hearing a lot from many people at all. Quite frankly, former President Trump is one of the few people to publicly react to the portions of the report being released today. A lot of the people you just mentioned really haven't said much today. We're hoping they'll say more in the future, but I think for them, they're taking kind of what you would normally hear from people when there's a pending investigative matter or a pending law enforcement matter, and they'll say, I'm going to just stay quiet while things are pending. Of course, that's not what former President Trump did, but that's what most of the people are just saying, we're going to let this play out. Of course, most people are also saying they did nothing wrong. They were forthcoming. They did what the court compelled them to do, what the special grand jury compelled them to do. As we know, some of the people on that list you pointed out did kind of, at first, they were hesitant to comply with the subpoena. There were some court hearings, preliminary court hearings, to frame some of that questioning, some of those former elected officials face, for example. But ultimately, they were compelled to testify, and they all said they did so to the extent that they were required to.
Charles, Lindsey Graham is one of those people who fought it, tried to go to court to stop his testimony, ultimately testified. He did a sort of walk and talk, and reporters asked him about his testimony, and he assured them that he did not have anything to worry about. When you look at that list, and we can put it back up, Michael Flynn has already been convicted of lying to the FBI, so we know that he's got a certain history. And Lindsey Graham, again, said that he testified truthfully. Mark Meadows is an interesting case because he would seem to be somebody who was very knowledgeable about the whole plot. When you see that list and you hear that somebody might have lied to a grand jury, your thoughts?
Hit the nail right on the head with the last name that you mentioned, which was Mark Meadows. I've been saying for a very long time that he is the linchpin, in my opinion, both at a state and federal level, to tying a number of different crimes to Donald Trump in terms of his actions. Because other than Mike Pence, Mark Meadows was probably the most closest to Donald Trump the entire time. And so I found it peculiar that the DOJ has now finally subpoenaed him and they're bringing him in. And I also think that if he did make any missteps with respect to his testimony in front of the Fulton County grand jury, that could be disastrous for Donald Trump. So for me, I'm obviously paying a lot of attention to Mark Meadows because of the high level of implications there. And then Lindsey Graham as well, because with him being a sitting United States senator, I know that he tried to toe a line with respect to speech and debate, but I'm sure that the prosecutors who were asking him questions in front of the grand jury were able to move around that. And so I'm very curious as to see whether he is now ensnared himself into some bigger entanglement, given his testimony and anything that he may have said to them, which the jury found to be untruthful. So those two names are the ones that jump out at me as I look at this list.
And we're going to come back to you on this because the CNN and the Wall Street Journal are reporting that the special counsel subpoenaed Mark Meadows in late January. Now, NBC has not confirmed that, so we'll come back to that. But that is what CNN and the Wall Street Journal are reporting. I want to come back to you, Tia, and talk a little bit about Fani Willis. She has brought some unusual cases, RICO cases against teachers. She's a pretty bold prosecutor. What do you make of the likelihood that she is the kind of prosecutor who would shoot for the king, as they say, for Donald Trump? Because, Donald Trump is at the head of this conspiracy. He reportedly even solicited research that he received the results of in December that confirmed for him that there was no fraud sufficient to overturn the elections in multiple states, including Georgia. We know that that is now true because of the Jack Smith investigation. And then in January, after receiving that research that included Georgia, he still gets on that call on January 2nd and asks for those 11,000 some odd votes. Is Fani Willis the kind of prosecutor, just based on your reporting, who would take that kind of a case? Or are we looking at cases for perjury here and not necessarily cases that involve Trump himself?
Well, okay, so you make a good point. Georgia's RICO laws have been applied in ways that go kind of farther outside just the people who are implicated in the actual doing of the crime. It's more of a conspiracy, and it was used years ago, predating even District Attorney Willis on the big Atlanta public school scandal. It's been used more recently by Fani Willis to prosecute a rap conglomerate that she alleges is a gang. And there are implications. There at least is the framing for potentially using those state RICO charges in this election investigation. Now, you're asking, will it go all the way to the head, former President Trump? Well, we do know that Trump and his allies continue to say that there was widespread fraud in Georgia's election in 2020, even after they were repeatedly told by their own investigators, as you've noted, their own attorneys, his own advisors, that that was not the case. Now, we don't know if Fani Willis is going to decide that Trump should be charged. We just don't know yet. that's what she's doing now, is deciding who to charge and what to charge them with. And she's going to bring that to the general grand jury. Now, what we believe is that report from the special grand jury that suggested charges, we believe it does suggest people in charges beyond perjury. Again, we don't know that for sure because that's not the portion that was released today. But the expectation is the special grand jury did suggest other types of charges related more directly to the attempts to overturn the election in Georgia. We don't know if Trump is among those that the special grand jury has suggested charging, but we do believe that there could be other folks that could be charged related to those efforts.